Hello. You must know that capitalism has slightly outlived its usefulness. In light to this, you've probably also heard this line before. What we need is a mixture of capitalism and socialism, usually followed with a, like in Europe. Usually, it's some well-meaning liberal that says this, but let's interrogate this point a little bit. Sometimes it's a more insidious type that reinforces their biases through statements like, true, nobody now imagines that what the world needs is the second coming of Gosplan. And, in other words, while communism failed, there's still a pretty good case for a mixed economy. If you've been sent this video, well, let's see where this train of thought leads to. Capitalism is a system predicated on markets, private property, and the private ownership of capital in all its forms, be it large amounts of money, natural resources, factories, land, etc. Another defining feature is wage labor, in which workers sell their labor power to a capitalist, or rather the capitalist class as a whole, who pay them in the form of wages. The capitalist then makes use of the labor of those hired workers to create new value in the form of commodities which are sold in capitalist markets. We live in a class system, with two overwhelming class groupings being the capitalist class, a tiny sliver of humanity, and the working class, basically almost everyone else. Petty bourgeois, lumpen, the various peasantry classes, etc. I won't touch on to keep your ear not talked off for now. Regardless, these two class groupings have fundamentally opposing interests. The interests of a capitalist are to work you harder, longer, and pay you as little as possible. The interests of a worker are the inverse, to work fewer hours for higher pay and secure working conditions. I go over the details in another set of videos here. Socialism, on the other hand, is a system in which the means of production, essentially everything used in social production, land, resources, factories, etc., are owned communally, usually through cooperative and state ownership, and directed by a working class political establishment. Socialism is a society in which the basic economic principle is from each according to their ability to each according to their work. I promise all this background is relevant. Socialism, in essence, focuses on something called the relations of production, meaning a fundamental reorganization of the enterprise from the capitalist model, in which there is a top-down organization from those that privately own and manage the enterprise, into a socialist model where there is democratic ownership and management of the enterprise by workers, either through trade unions, industrial syndicates, or state ownership, or all three possibly. Likewise, socialism tackles the political baggage of class rule, which currently is entirely penetrated by ruling class, meaning capitalist class interests and representatives. There's a clear contradiction in goals here. Nowhere is this clearer than the current climate crisis, which general reporting from particularly right-wing biased sources has a massive blind spot for. Frequently, during the research for my videos, I encounter these biased sources that don't publicly state their leanings, or even worse, their funding. This can be very irritating, but not with the sponsor of this video, Ground News. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform that makes it easy to read between the lines of media bias and break free from algorithms. Their mission is to build media literacy and to fight misinformation. See this article titled "Science Learns to Quickly Link Extreme Weather and Climate" as an example, which only one single right-wing biased source has bothered to reproduce, while on the other hand is heavily reported by what Ground News considers to be left-leaning coverage. One of the many strengths of the platform, Ground News allows you to spot media bias by giving you a visual breakdown of how many total sources have reported on the story, as well as a brief glance of headlines from across the political spectrum. It also allows you to check your blind spots and see which news stories are being underreported. If you click on a story, you can dig even deeper through a comprehensive breakdown, read every headline, view the political bias and factuality score for every source, and even read the articles themselves right from the app, which is also available for download. My favorite feature is their global coverage, which allows you to see how international stories are being covered across the globe using an interactive map. So what are you waiting for? Go to ground.news/Hakim or the link in the description to try Ground News for free, or subscribe to get access to all the features you see here and support a small team of independent media outsiders working to make the news more transparent. Big thanks to Ground News for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is very appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Capitalism means private property. Note, not personal property as in your guitar or house, but private ownership of industry and its prerequisites, for example. Socialism is for the abolition of private property. One is for the top-down capitalist model of the enterprise, the other is for worker ownership and management through various methods, be they state or otherwise. One is for wage labor, the other is for the abolition of wage labor. At every turn, the intended changes and consequences of the two systems clash, as they represent the interests of two classes that cannot be reconciled, the working class and the capitalist class. I touch on a little more on a similar contradiction in my previous video here. So, putting aside the class collaborationist angle, which is historically as well as theoretically untenable, we need to deal with two other things. Do these liberals even really intend socialism? And what do they mean by like in Europe, exactly? This is a common pitfall of some of the well-meaning types. They think safety nets and some maternity leave is socialism, and this is far less their fault and more the fault of general educational systems that refuse to teach what socialism really is, for obvious reasons. What they're really talking about is something called social democracy, which historically used to mean actual socialism, but that usage of the term became obsolete in the early 20th century. Social democracy is capitalism in a concessionary stage. The only reason social democracies rose was because the USSR was right next door, providing all those same social safeties and more, and the second it was gone, the ruling class got to work dismantling. Initially, post-World War II, a grand rebuilding of Europe, combined with the sheer popularity of socialist forces, both in the form of political parties in France, Italy, etc., as well as the influence of then-existing socialist nations such as the USSR, with its full employment, free healthcare, education, extensive social benefits, amongst all the rest, resulted in a choice for the ruling classes of the re-emerging European nations. Either they acquiesce to the general demands represented by socialist forces without giving up their power, or risk losing power through revolution mixed with popular electoral action. They picked the former, and so was European social democracy born. Of course, unlike in socialist countries, social democratic countries supported their social programs through neo-colonial, imperialist, and otherwise exploitative relations with the economic periphery, which today runs to the level of over $10 trillion, if you can believe it. If you're interested in the details, check out my unequal exchange video here. That point is incredibly important. In European social democracies, all those safety nets are paid for through less than pleasant means and off the backs of the Third World. Britain and France were massive imperial powers that built their wealth on the destruction of indigenous industry, colonial taxes, the direct theft of the areas and peoples they've subjugated, and ongoing neo-colonial exploitation through 1,000 methods. Even those countries that didn't have direct empires still exploit the imperial periphery via insidious trade policies and illicitly got an ownership stake in Third World natural resources. Companies in social democratic countries take advantage of cheap immigrant labor at home and cheap imperial periphery labor abroad. They rely on market preference via IMF restructuring of third world economies that puts the core, the first world, an advantage over the periphery. This is something made beautifully clear in the works of Zach Cope, John Smith, Intan Swandi, and others, which I cannot recommend enough. Regardless, social democracy basically advocates for, rather than stripping the capitalist class of their unearned privilege and stolen wealth, we instead grovel at their feet for small concessions that they'll regally laud over you as some great self-sacrificing favor, despite the fact that workers, much like yourself, were the originators of all that wealth that's providing for these concessions in the first place. In any case, the system cannot last. Capitalism always needs higher profits, so concessions will eventually be stripped away, as we're currently seeing. In essence, a mixture of capitalism and socialism simply means the protection of the political setup, economic dominance, and exploitative nature of capitalism at the expense of the supposed socialism being mixed in. Capitalism is an untenable system due to recurrent boom and bust cycles that impoverish millions and ruin entire economies, environmental impact which has resulted in the highest temperatures humanity has seen in God knows how many thousands of years, the senseless pursuit of never-ending profit to the detriment and overexploitation of the third world as well as the first, perpetual unemployment in the form of reserve armies of labor, the falling rate of profit, imperialism, I could go on and on. If all of that is the case, then why does this mixture sentiment exist? Well, for a variety of reasons. Many people simply don't know, through no fault of their own. There also is a difficulty in imagining socialism since it's either demonized or entirely obscured from our vision. Mostly though, it's a sort of inbuilt liberal brainwashing as a result of liberal institutions intended to fixate and force the middle position outlook. This never really is actually in the middle, by the way, and that's perfectly illustrated by the example of this entire video where capitalism being supposedly mixed with socialism simply remains capitalism with all the domination it had prior. Being a centrist isn't the intelligent or correct opinion, it's simply what is most ideologically comfortable and convenient. A centrist doesn't have to do any real reading, they don't have to interrogate the logic of an idea, they can fully rely on what they already know, or alternatively have been taught, to reach a conclusion and then pat themselves on the back. Everyone should get vaccinated against polio, for example. This isn't an area where being a centrist makes sense. Likewise with water treatment, or safety regulations in buildings, or fuel quality, or a million other real-world examples. Socialism is objectively in the interests of the vast majority of people and has the historic data to back it up as well. The vast majority of the time, socialism gave people a higher standard of living than capitalism, given equal levels of economic development, and that's a very important point. This is true for infant mortality, child death rates, life expectancy, number of health professionals per population, enrollment in educational institutions, general access to healthcare and education, per capita calorie supply. At almost every meaningful measure, the flawed historical experience of socialism still manages to produce relatively staggering results. Keep in mind, many of these countries achieve such staggering growth and development in the face of invasion, constant sabotage, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and so much more from the US and its strategic allies. My video on the socialism has always failed argument delves deeper if you're interested. For those who like to read, which should be all of you, how about some book recommendations on the various topics just to get you started? The first and greatest introduction is Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, which covers excellent ground on imperialism, the general support of capitalism for fascist policies when necessary, the victories and failures of historic socialism, how we should engage with said history, amongst much more. For a great dive into how imperial core countries exploit the periphery, check out Zach Cope's The Wealth of Some Nations for the economic side, and Torkel Laussen's The Global Perspective, Reflections on Imperialism and Resistance for the political side. For general reading on imperialism and its horrors, check out the absolutely excellent work Killing Hope by Blum, The Triumph of Evil by Murphy, and The Jakarta Method by Bevins. If you want an overview of just the United States, Endless Holocausts, Mass Death in the History of the United States Empire by Smith is a sobering read. And yes, the title does go that hard. And that's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kudrow. Thanks for watching.